Kyle today. Kyle said, gosh, I wish I could be there to hear Norm. And I'm sorry. Just trying to see.
They're asking for.
You have to be special to sit in that chair.
I'm special.
You want me to hold it?
No.
I love this chair.
First of all, I thought the food was great. So I don't know who prepared it, but
See the table.
just to tell you who I am, not that I'm anybody special, but so you know where I've been for the last 40 years. We moved to Escondido back in 1970, and I started practice in internal medicine in Escondido. So I've been an internist in Escondido for 43 years. And I'm sort of officially retiring as of the end of December. So that's where I've been. And so you know, in the space program, everybody was famous in the old days. You remember Mercury? I don't know if you're all old enough to remember this.
Oh,
We're way so the nature
But
of
there used to be, the Mercury program, the Gemini program, the Apollo program. Everybody knew the astronaut's name, and nowadays you don't know anybody's name because there's so many of them. And once the Apollo program was over, there was Skylab, and then there was a shuttle program, and now once that ended, it's like nothing's happening. Which is not actually true, but it just seems that way. Anyway, Christine was gracious enough to ask me to talk about stuff that happened 50 years ago. So she asked 2 weeks ago, and it's taken me 2 weeks to try to remember. You know, I sit down and go, I wonder, I can't think of her name, or I can't. And then, 3 days later, it hits you while you're taking a shower or something. So I started writing things down. So I got my notes here in case I lose my memory. So, little did I know that back in the 50s, I was being groomed for the space program. Little did I know. I thought I was going to become a doctor. So back in 1956, I graduated from high school. And from there, I went to college at Stanford and majored in biology and psychology. And in 1957, October 4th, 1957, you know what happened? Sputnik. 23-inch sphere, launched into space by the Russians. We would go outside at night from my dorm and watch that thing go over. You probably didn't do that, did you?
Oh, yeah.
And we were amazed, and we thought, why the Russians? What's wrong with us? And so that was the beginning of what was called the space race. Then in 1960, I graduated from Stanford and went to medical school at the University of Utah. So I was there from 1960 to 64. Again, preparing for the space program. So it's fun for me to talk about my experiences. So I did have some interesting experiences when I was in medical school, but I don't think we got time for all that. But I did work at Deseret Mortuary in Salt Lake City. I picked up dead bodies for them at night. And I don't know if you ever remember Deseret Mortuary. I don't even know if it's still there or not, but it was a 2-story building with a basement. And when I was on call at night, I slept up in the celestial room, which was at the end of a long, winding staircase. And from from that room, I could see down into the viewing room and watch the lightning as it went over the mountains to the east. It was just like those little Frankenstein movies. And then the elevator that went down to the basement where they did the embalming, you know, was jump, 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 down to the embalming room. I think I scared the embalmer a few times. And then the other summers that I worked there, I worked in pathology doing autopsies at the VA hospital, and then I did some research work at the hospital in biochemistry. At any rate, so that was that, while the space program was going on, and I was preparing for this big adventure. So in 1965, or 1964, I graduated from medical school and took my rotating internship in Santa Barbara. Meanwhile, in April of 1961, first human space flight, Yuri Gagarin. He orbited the Earth once. He landed out in the farmland, was able to get out of his capsule and hail a passing farmer and asked him where he could find a phone so he could let Moscow know where he was. And that was the first manned space flight, one orbit. And it was shortly after that Alan Shepard, back in May of '61, did our suborbital flight for our team. And then again in February of '62, John Glenn orbited the Earth 3 times in the Mercury capsule. And it was in 1961 that Kennedy made his speech where he said, "Our goal is to reach the moon and return safely by the end of the decade." That was an immense challenge. In my internship, rotating internship, so I did, pediatrics, obstetrics, emergency room, medicine, surgery, all that stuff, preparing me for the space program. But as you know, back in the '60s was the time that the Vietnam War was going on, and doctors were in great demand, and there was a significant chance, I thought, that I would get drafted. And so rather than get drafted and be given and being told what service I was going to go into, I enlisted and chose the Air Force, because I figured if there was anything I wanted to do, it would be fun to go flying, So I enlisted in the Air Force, and my first orders were to report to Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, where I was giving my basic training. Basic training for physicians is a lot different than basic training for other people. But we did learn how to use an ejection seat. We did learn how to land if we had a parachute. We learned how to look at ears, nose, and throat, which we were supposed to already know how to do, I think. And we saw a lot of movies about the importance of air power. So, and then we got our orders from Brooks Air Force Base. My orders said to report to NASA, Houston. I said, wow. All these other guys were getting their orders to go to different places, and they were saying how wonderful it's going to be. They were going to see patients. And I said, NASA, Houston, I don't get to see patients for a couple of years. Or at least I didn't think so. But I didn't mind. I figured I'd be seeing patients the rest of my life. So when I got to Houston, I was interviewed by Dr. Berry, Charles Berry, who was the medical head of NASA at the time of the space program. I was interviewed by him, and it turned out that they were losing the doctor that they had at Kennedy Space Center because he had turned out, and they needed to replace him, and Dr. Berry was trying to decide whether to put a new guy in there or whether to put the new guy at Houston and send somebody from Houston down to Kennedy Space Center. And when I heard this, I talked him into sending me to Kennedy Space Center. I said, look, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I'm not in the Navy. So he conceded that, and my next orders were to go to Kennedy Space Center by way of Patrick Air Force Base. And Patrick Air Force Base is in Cocoa Beach, and it was there that I was stationed there in the military. Any military people in NASA were told not to wear the uniforms when they were at work, because we were not a military organization, we were a civilian organization. So any of us in the military who worked for NASA wore a shirt and tie to work. And I had a nice office, nice 4-story building, and the medical department was on this end, and the astronaut quarters were at this end. They wanted to stay as far away from the doctors as possible. The doctors were the ones that had the power to keep them from flying. And so they told us very little. It wasn't like we were buddies. But actually, my job there was being the astronaut's physician. I was supposed to be able to take care of whatever came up, colds, diarrhea, whatever. And that was my job. I had a secretary. I remember her name was Peggy, but I can't remember her last name. And I had a sergeant assistant who was Huey Crocker. I just remembered his last name yesterday. So that was my job. And so part of the job was to try to be involved with safety issues. So, and we'll get to that later. We'll talk about some of the things there that we were involved in. So when I got there, I was there basically for the Gemini program. Gemini 1 through 4 had already flown. 1 and 2 were unmanned. 3 and 4 had already flown, and 4 was where Ed White was the first American astronaut to exit the spacecraft in orbit. It's always seemed like a fearsome thing to do. And this is me in my Air Force uniform at Patrick Air Force Base. Handsome young man. And I lived in that ugly-looking place there behind me.
That's right.
Were you married?
That's base housing.
Were you married at that time?
Yeah.
Where's your wife? Somewhere in
Just taking a picture. I got you off the hook.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
So what you have to understand is that the Mercury and Gemini program, well, first of all, the Apollo program was to land a man on the moon and return safely, to explore the lunar surface. And that program had been envisioned since actually the 50s, and the Mercury and the Gemini program were part of that program because Mercury and Gemini were necessary in order to provide the knowledge that they needed in order to make the lunar trip. In the early 60s, there were different ideas floating out there as to how this should be done. And one of the ideas was to build a huge rocket. They called it the Nova, which never was built and never flew. But it was going to be bigger than the Saturn rocket, and it was going to get the man to the moon, turn around, and land like you see in the movies, and then it was going to take off from the lunar surface and come home. The reason that got scrapped ultimately was it required too much fuel and too much thrust, and it was not technically feasible at the time. Ultimately, they went with the idea of having a 3-stage rocket put in orbit, and then from the orbit they used the 3rd stage of the rocket to eject them into a translunar trajectory to go to the moon. Then they would have to separate themselves from that rocket, turn around, and then go back and hook up with the lunar module, and then pull away from that S4B, 3rd stage of the Saturn. Then that 3rd stage would be sent into an orbit that either would crash into the moon or would go past the moon into lunar orbit. Then they would take those components, the lunar module and the command and service module, and go to the vicinity of the moon, and with a few course corrections, they would go into an orbit that was like 60 miles above the lunar surface. They would then use the service module engine to circularize the orbit around the moon. Then they would put two guys into the lunar module, separate from them, and then the lunar module descent engine would have to be fired to put them into an orbit which would bring them within 50,000 feet of the lunar surface. And then from there, they would then ignite that descent engine again to allow them to have a controlled landing on the surface of the moon. Then when they're done with what they're doing on the moon, they get back into it. That descent engine becomes the platform for the ascent stage of the lunar module, which takes them back into lunar orbit. They reunite with the command and service module dock. The two guys in the lunar module get back into the spacecraft that's circling the Earth. They then jettison the lunar module. It crashes on the moon. Then they take the command and service module, ignite that engine again, and send them back toward the Earth. And with a few corrections to get them right into the right plane, they then, just before they re-enter, they have to jettison the service module, and they bring that Apollo capsule back. The Apollo capsule is like 11 and a half feet tall, about 12 feet around. So that's all that's left of this giant rocket that was 363 feet tall to begin with. So you see all those maneuvers from separating and docking and rendezvousing in lunar orbit and doing all those things all that knowledge had to be obtained beforehand. And that was where the Gemini program came in. So when I got there, they already had the first 4 done. When I got there, they were in the process of doing 5 and 6. And 5 and 6, if you remember, involved sending one Gemini spacecraft up for 2 weeks, and then sending a second Gemini spacecraft up to rendezvous. I don't know if you remember it, there were pictures of these two spacecraft together up there. They could wave to each other. So they were perfected the rendezvous. They also they used an Agena rocket so that they could then rendezvous with this Agena rocket and dock with it, and then use that rocket to push them into a different orbit. Again, that involved techniques for rendezvous and docking. And they also had to figure out how to make a spacesuit that would work on the moon, and how to work outside the spacecraft, because they found initially that they were working way too hard to try to get things done outside the spacecraft. And it took a guy named Buzz Aldrin, who apparently had some experience working underwater or something, but he was able to develop the techniques that they still use today to work outside the spacecraft. So Gemini 5 through 12 were on my watch, and during those launches, I was usually in what we called the blockhouse at the time, which was a short distance from the space where the spacecraft was launched. And they used what was called the Gemini Titan II. The Titan II was a ballistic missile, which they used for the Gemini program. And this is a picture of the launch. I wasn't always in the blockhouse, but most of the time I was. So if you want to look at that, it's I have very few pictures left because we had a storage unit where we kept a lot of stuff. You don't expect those places to burn down, but my unit burned up in a fire, and a lot of my pictures and stuff were gone. I had my slides and things where I could show you all kinds of things.
You mean we could have had a slideshow?
We don't do slides anymore.
In the old days.
They put them on a DVD and.
Well, anyway, so that was 65, and through the end of 66 was the Gemini program, and then we started in earnest with the Apollo program. So all those maneuvers were necessary to perfect the techniques they were needed to get to the moon and back. So I was going to talk a little bit about the rockets because they always impressed me. The Mercury suborbital flight, they flew on a Redstone rocket. And when we talk about rockets and the power, we talk about thrust. Okay, so the Redstone rocket was able to develop 78,000 pounds of thrust liftoff. And that was enough to put a man in a suborbital trajectory. The other rocket they used for the Mercury program was an Atlas, and I don't remember the thrust that it developed.
It
was not impressive, I'll tell you that. Then the Titan missile developed 430,000 pounds of thrust at liftoff, and it was able to put the Gemini spacecraft in orbit. Now, the Gemini spacecraft, we usually likened it to about the size of a Volkswagen. And it had, obviously had 2 seats, 2 doors, and it had a storage compartment behind it. And so that's what these guys would ride in for 2 weeks at a time sometimes. And it got pretty stuffy in there. And we had a couple of systems. One was the Blue Bag system, which was used to store human waste. And they would seal those and store them in their bags so they could be analyzed when we got back to see how they were metabolizing various things like calcium, magnesium, and stuff. Because one of the things they had to learn in Gemini and Mercury was how well we would do in weightlessness and prolonged time and space, and taking measurements of all their byproducts was part of that.
So did you get to do some hands-on that?
I didn't have any hands-on experience with that.
Assistant, that's why you have an assistant.
Once they lifted it off from the pad, I was out of the loop. Went to Houston then. Well, they always said though that they would urinate into they had like a condom catheter, and that would go into a little compartment, and then they would seal that off and open the valve to the outside. And when that urine went out, of course, it instantly became crystallized. And they said it was very pretty at sunrise. So, the Apollo escape system, the little rocket on top of the Apollo spacecraft, remember that the Titan was 430,000 pounds of thrust. That escape system had to generate 147,000 pounds of thrust, just to remove the spacecraft from the rest of the rocket should there be a problem on the pad. And then, of course, the Saturn V rocket, which ultimately was used for the lunar landing, for the Skylab, and developed 7.5 or 7.6 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. And actually, the thrust would increase to about 9 million pounds of thrust as the first stage burned. The first stage would burn 13 metric tons of fuel per second. So when you look at that and you find the thrust, you're losing weight up here and you're maintaining thrust here, you're going to go faster and faster.
On those rockets, were those before they used solid fuel, or were those liquid fuel?
Those are liquid fuel.
Liquid fuel.
Yeah, oxygen was used. The second, third stage of the Saturn rocket were hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah.
And they burned very hot. The first stage would get it 42 miles up and the speed of about 6,500 miles an hour. Second stage would get them up to about 15,000 miles per hour, and the third stage would get them into orbit at about 17,500 miles an hour. And then then that fourth stage would be then be utilized then to reignite and send them toward the moon. Because they circled the Earth a couple times to make sure everything was working properly. And when those engines ignite, those 5 engines, there are 5 engines on the first stage. They wouldn't all ignite exactly at the same time. They were milliseconds apart. The center and then the 2 on each side, like that, because of the stresses it would put on the rocket frame, they had to stagger a little.
Oh, really? A friend of mine, oh, I'm sorry, but go ahead.
Was that German fellow that we brought over?
Werner von Braun.
Was he involved in?
Yes, he was one of the 2 guys that designed the Saturn V system.
I was just gonna say, one of the guys that graduated with me from high school was one of the engineers that designed the reusable rocket engines, where they would fall back through the atmosphere a certain way so they wouldn't burn up.
Yeah,
He engineered that.
try to make it cheaper.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
That was pretty cool.
Called recycling.
Yeah. Way ahead of your time.
Anyway, so that Saturn V was 363 feet tall and 33 feet around at the base. It was the tallest, heaviest, most powerful rocket that was ever operational. At the time, we were in this race to the moon with the Russians, and we didn't know. They were very secretive about their program. And so we didn't know how close they were to getting man on the moon, or how close they were to getting the moon. So they were developing a rocket they called the N1. And what we later found out is that they had 4 launches of the N1. The N1 was different than our Saturn in that our Saturn had 5 large engines. The N1 had 30 small engines. And just thinking about the numbers and the complexity of trying to make all those rockets work at the same time, you could understand why it blew up 4 times and was never operational. It would have developed 9 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, so it would have been the biggest, but it never worked. But we didn't know that at the time. So we hurried up and we sent Apollo 8 around the moon. But before I get to that, what am I going to talk about? Okay. So, it's my job as safety officer, right? Sort of. I really wasn't a safety officer, but I was supposed to be involved with their health. And so I get to go anywhere on the base that they went. So my badge, I had clearance to go anywhere I wanted to. Anywhere the astronauts could go, I could go. So if they were doing some sort of training, I'd go out and train with them. Got nothing else to do. So we did a number of things. One was the Vomit Comet. This was the 747 that was designed to simulate zero gravity.
Oh, yeah.
And they would put the Gemini spacecraft in there, for example, and mock up, and they would use it to train getting out and getting back in, doing things. And so I went on the Vomit Comet 3 times, and I vomited on at least 2 of those times. Because you're going from nice level to you're pulling up into a steep climb, and you pull 3 or 4 Gs, and then they let off on the engines and you just fall. And during that 30 seconds of fall, you're essentially weightless in relationship to everything else in the aircraft, so you can tumble around in there all you want, as long as you don't get in the way of those guys down there who are doing what they're supposed to do. The rest of us take pictures and turning somersaults. So there was that experience. The next one was the Gemini, the escape method from the Gemini spacecraft was a wire from the spacecraft to the ground. And supposedly if they had time, they were supposed to get out of the spacecraft, hook up that thing, slide down this wire.
Who Whose idea was that?
Yeah.
The Gemini spacecraft also had ejection seats, but they were never, no real person ever ejected from those, so nobody ever knew if they really would work. So,
From how high
That's
up?
where you see the
well,
pictures.
the Gemini
of the
spacecraft was like
dummy.
100 and some feet up. And
Oh, this was to be used before actually leaving the,
if they got up there and there was a problem, they had to escape, they either could do the line.
oh, I thought
They
they
could
could,
eject.
I thought they were on their way up or something.
No, no. After launch, you have to use the ejection seats.
Yeah.
Before launch, you could use the wire. After launch, okay. So Gemini 6, Wally Schirra was up there. And I don't know if you remember or not, but on that particular launch, the engines on the Titan missiles ignited and then shut down. Technically, he was supposed to eject. But because he said he didn't feel the spacecraft leave the ground, or the rocket leave the ground, he chose not to eject. And then he was really upset when he got down from the spacecraft and found reporters down there taking his picture. He said, "This is supposed to be dangerous. Why are these guys down here taking our picture?" So a disaster was averted. What we call man-rated, the altitude chambers, the biggest chambers in the world at the time. We also man-rated hyperbaric chambers, which we had in case they got the bends. We could also use it for divers if they were brought in. We never had to use it during my time it was there. Being the doctor for the astronauts, they could come in and tell me all their personal problems and stuff, which they never did. But I remember Jim Lovell came in one time and with a straight face, he said, "You know, my girlfriend's got gonorrhea. Could you give me some medicine for her?" You know, and I'm going, "Dude, I'm supposed to see these patients before I prescribe them." You know, and so he just thought that was the funniest thing because he got me all tense. And then after a successful launch and return, we usually had a party, and one of the parties, Wally Schirra, early on in the program, was a smoker, and so they always put a pack of cigarettes in the back so that he could be tempted and couldn't reach him. So on one of the match covers, at one of these parties, he sent it to me and he said, "You were matchless."
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How do they handle being in such close quarters for such long periods of time?
How do they handle it?
Yeah, did they have
It's a
to go through?
psychological evaluation.
Yeah, did they have to go through psychological evaluations and stuff like that? And were you part of that?
I was not part of their evaluation for that, no.
Uh-huh.
All the original Mercury astronauts and later the Gemini astronauts were all put through a very thorough psychological and physical examination. Remember the movie The Right Stuff? There's
Right.
a lot of poking fun about all the stuff that they went through for that.
Right.
They did not like doctors because of that. They thought we were too intrusive on their personal lives, personal bodily functions. And so that's why they were not real happy about coming down to see me for much of anything. So on flight day, they would have to come down to my office and get their pre-flight physical.
Mm-hmm.
So they would come down there and I'd check them out and make sure they were not sick. And I would clear them. I would get them to autograph their picture for me. And I'd send them on their way.
So you went through Apollo 12, so you didn't have, were you involved with the guy that didn't go on 13?
I was involved, and I'll get to that in a minute.
I'm jumping the gun.
Getting ahead of me. This is a picture of inside the Vomit Comet. I am not in this picture. I don't think. No, I'm not in this picture. But this would be watching the guys in the Gemini spacecraft practicing whatever they were practicing. They'd have 30 seconds to do whatever. Then the plane would have to do the same maneuver again, and they'd just stop what they were doing, and And then we got weightless again, and they continue on, and that way they got to see what it was like. They also used, big pools to practice their weightless activities in as well. So there's that. Okay. At the, on one occasion, Shirley MacLaine came to see me. She'd come to see me. She came to see the Kennedy Space Center, and I was on her list so she could see the medical quarters before I took her down to the astronaut quarters and all that sort of thing. So I got to meet Shirley MacLaine, and I'm sure she remembers that. And then, of course, at the end of the Gemini program, they had a big party, and a lot of people came. So I met a number of people there. Walter Cronkite. You remember Hugh O'Brien? He was there, and that's the only two people I can remember, besides the astronauts. Okay, during that time, we're trying to make this church related. During that time, 65 to 67, I was ordained to 70. You've heard of 70s before? We ain't no more.
Nope.
But I was ordained to 70 there. I was made a scout leader, and on Gemini 12, yes.
Salt Lake 70 or?
No.
No, 70 area.
Yeah. Brother Munns ordained me at 70. He was the state president at the time in Orlando. And at that time, the entire state of Florida was the Florida mission. It wasn't divided up into multiple missions like it is today. And so on Gemini 12, I was able to get Jim Lovell, my old buddy, to take a small copy of the Book of Mormon aboard the Gemini 12 spacecraft. So when they got back, they returned it to me, they autographed it, and the book had been given to me by the elders in the Florida mission there that were in our ward. And so they had signed it too, I believe. And so when I got it back, I gave it back, I presented it back to the Florida mission. Now, in my naivety, I thought this little book that had circumnavigated the world in a spacecraft was going to be part of the mission. I thought it would stay in the mission home. Well, what I found out years later is that the mission president took it with him when he went home. So Eldred Winrud, I don't know if anybody knew him, he was the mission president at the time. So he took it home with him, unbeknownst to me. I just thought it was the mission all these years. And then later on, I found out that he actually had it on his mantle at home. And it's since been donated to one of the museums up there just south of the temple in Salt Lake City. So if I get a chance, I'm going to go up there to see if I can find it. So that was the first Book of Mormon to circle the world.
That's cool.
Okay. Now, the Apollo program was moving along at this time, but the lunar excursion module and the command module of the Apollo were running into a lot of glitches. Little minor things.
That's so minor.
And as a result, the Apollo program got set back a bit. However, on January 27th, 1967, we had an Apollo countdown where we were going to do everything that was going to be done on the first Apollo flight, except we weren't going to launch the vehicle. And so I spent most of the day at the Cape in the command area and monitoring the astronauts in the spacecraft. I had given them all a shot of penicillin earlier that morning because they were worried about getting strep throat. And then they went off to the module. That was Grissom, White, and Chaffee. And later that afternoon, one of the other doctors replaced me, and I went home, and then I heard on the news there was a fire at the that a number of problems happen, but in our program with military aircraft and with the space program, we used 100% oxygen in everything they did. That's just the way we did things, and nobody gave it a second thought, because it had been successful through Mercury, Gemini, line out Apollo. So when they purchased the spacecraft, they made it 100% oxygen, and then they had a short inside the spacecraft, and anything that would burn immediately burned. And the 3 astronauts basically were asphyxiated. They did not burn to death, they were asphyxiated. They made an attempt to get out, but couldn't. Chappie was on the couch on the right-hand side, untouched, basically. And Ed White was in the center couch, and he tried to open the hatch, couldn't, because of the bad design. And Grissom had tried to get away from the fire, so it must have started at his feet, on the left-hand side, because his left leg was burned. So, that was a tragic accident.
That's the first time I remember having heard that they didn't burn.
Yeah. They did.
Yeah.
Do you guys
Did you
remember
have
that?
to go up on the outside of that?
To get into.
Yeah, we go, okay.
They had a documentary on TV about it,
Well, they did?
yeah. About the oxygen.
Well, here's the thing with the Apollo spacecraft. What they did, they kind of leads me into a couple things that probably I wanted to talk about. One is, they built what they called the vertical assembly building, or the vehicle assembly building, where they would stack the rocket parts. And then, where the Russians would always lift the rocket up like this to the launch pad, we stacked them in this building and then drove them out to the launch site. That building was one of the biggest buildings in the world at the time. It was so huge inside that they had to have huge air conditioning units to keep it from raining on humid days in Florida. And there were a lot of humid days in Florida. And then the doors, there were 4 bay doors, and those doors would open, from the bottom up and then fold up to the top. Those doors were so big you could slide the UN building into one of those doors.
Oh my goodness.
They used a machine called the Crawler. The Crawler had a pad on top that was kept vertical so that the machine could go up a 5% grade to the launch site and hold the rocket perfectly level. And next to the rocket was that tower, they called that the launch umbilical tower. So when they rolled it out, it's the only picture I had left. Launch umbilical tower here, Saturn V, vertical assembly building, yours truly, with dark hair. So that just to prove you I really was there. And so the crawler could lift 12 million pounds and would take the vehicle out to the launch site. So when they had the fire, you go out to the launch site and you go up the launch umbilical tower.
Was it like an elevator?
Yeah. You go up the elevator, then you get out the walkway, and then there's the clean room, and then there's the spacecraft. When we got up there, you could see the spacecraft that actually kind of popped. It's like suddenly popping a balloon. And it was so hot they couldn't get in there to do anything, and they couldn't rescue the astronauts. But as a result of that fire, the space program got delayed a year while they investigated the fire, redesigned the hatch, made some changes in the spacecraft to make it better. And as a result, I was not involved with the rest of the Apollo program, where I would have been had they done it right in the first place. But during that 6-month period, between January and the end, I had some experiences where I got to go temporary duty station to Edwards Air Force Base, and got to fly in a helicopter to monitor one of the flights of the X-15 rocket plane and the XB-70 Valkyrie, which became obsolete before it was finally developed, but which was designed to fly greater than Mach 3 at 70,000 feet, which submarine Polaris type, which they would do a lot of their training out at Cape Canaveral, which was the southern part of Kennedy Space Center, and they came into port, they wanted to see the Space Center, I wanted to see the submarine. So we made an exchange. They came and saw my quarters, I went and saw their quarters. I was impressed with the submarine because you walk in and the doctor's quarters is about this big, about this wide, with one cot in there and some medicines there, and that was it.
Was this a diesel sub?
No, this was atomic sub.
Oh, this was an atomic.
And then just outside over here, you had 2 rows of Polaris missiles with atomic warheads. Two rows of, I think, 8 missiles, so there's 16 missiles on that.
Well, you're a doc, how is it that they can read, like in Japan, when they pull into port there, they can read whether they have any nukes on board, and guys that are in like the sonar room, like my brother-in-law was, are laying on top of those things, and now are all coming down with Parkinson's disease and things like that they think are caused.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
That's great, okay.
I can't comment.
Yeah,
I was just impressed at how small the doctor's quarters were.
yeah, oh, okay.
Compared to the 16 missiles here, which were able to destroy the world, you know, with one call.
Yeah, each one's got multiple warheads in it.
Yeah, each one had multiple words, and this was a redesign, so this was in early '67, and so the other part of that trip was to go on the ship that would go out and monitor a launch. So the submarine went out and launched a missile, and we were able to watch it from not too far away.
Cool.
On this boat. So that was really interesting. Neil Armstrong was one of the ones that flew the X-15. It went Mach 6.72, set a world record of over 6,000 miles per hour. That's just fun information. I don't know if it's worth anything. And that ended my career in the Air Force because in order to stay with NASA, I would have had to exit the Air Force, take a residency in what do we call it? Preventive medicine or something, I don't know. And then that would have been 2 years and then go back and hope I could get in, you know. And I wanted to see patients, that's what I went into medicine for. So that wasn't my cup of tea. So I exited the Air Force and came to Riverside, took a residency in internal medicine, and then came to Escondido July 1st, 1970, and I've been here ever since. So
So you never got to go to Area 51 or anything like that?
no, I never went to Area 51. I'm not sure I even knew about it in those days.
What was the astronaut's name that was killed up by Ojai on a motorcycle accident? Was that Buzz Aldrin or?
No, Buzz Aldrin's still
No,
alive.
Buzz Aldrin's still alive.
Oh,
Wally Schirra passed on. A number of them have passed
no,
on.
maybe.
I think it was, I can't be sure, but I remember reading about it. I'm thinking Pete Conrad, but I'm not sure.
No, I don't think that was it. It was one of the famous guys in the
Yeah.
corner that the corner that he went around, it was like, how could you run into that rock? After flying to the moon.
Yeah. The Apollo program, Apollo 8, just for completeness here, Apollo 8 was the first human flight to see the backside of the moon. They orbited the moon 10 times and then returned. And that was Borman, Lovell, and Anders.
How long did it take to get around one side?
Good question.
How many
Let
days
us
were
know
we
next month.
I was thinking 10 times how long that take.
Yeah, well, they were 60 miles above the surface, and I don't remember how the diameter of the sun, I can't tell you.
17,000 miles an hour, that's.
Well, they're going pretty fast, but I can't even tell you their speed. But if you remember on that flight, Borman, Lovell, and Anders, they read from Genesis, because it was Christmas time. They read the first 10 verses of Genesis. Can you imagine that happening today?
Unfortunately.
Would be allowed to have the Bible with them on it.
Well, I think that's one of my questions. I was gonna say, did they have a Bible that went around with them too? I mean, at the Book of Mormon, but
That I
I'm
don't know.
pretty sure that if they read from Genesis, they
I
had a
let
Bible.
my Christian Protestant friends worry about the Bible. Then there was Apollo 11, of course, where we landed on the moon. That was in July of 1969. Then there was Apollo 13. Apollo 13 was a disaster waiting to happen. It should have been fixed before it ever got to the launch pad, but it never got fixed. And the fixes that were recommended didn't get done properly.
It was so cold.
Should have had another number, should have been 15 or 14.
I remember that day, how cold it was back then.
No 13th floor in Las Vegas.
So when they stirred the oxygen tank, the oxygen tank exploded, and the rest is history. Then there was Apollo 17, which was the last mission that was flown in December of 1972. Flights 18, 19, and 20 were canceled, partly, well, because of budgetary constraints, and some of that money went to fund the shuttle program. The shuttle, when it lifts off, develops 6.7 or 8 million pounds of thrust, so it was less than Saturn V. Saturn V was the biggest, tallest functional rocket ever made, probably ever will be made. Apollo 17 being the last one, I was able to fly to Florida and watch that launch. It was a night launch, and I didn't want to miss it because the Saturn has a tremendous flame. And when you're 3 miles away, it rocks you. So, anyway, so that was my experience with the space program. I'm sure I've left off stuff. You got any questions?
The Jet Propulsion Laboratory up here, they're like in direct contact with Houston.
JPL, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, JPL,
Yeah.
because a fellow down here in Alonso, when he moved down, he was like one of the high ups in the Apollo program from JPL.
Yeah. Well, I don't know anybody.
Yeah. I know that his mine was worth enough money, they put cameras all around his house.
We worked on that building one time, up on the roof. That was pretty
I was
cool.
just wondering if you ever, how do I put this? Did you ever see the hand of God in the space program? Do you know what I'm saying?
I hadn't thought about it in that way.
Well, so many people say it's such a waste of money. Well, no, and I think lots of great things came with that program.
Yeah, what I would say is, to me, getting a man from here to the moon and back safely, not only once but multiple times, was a tremendous feat of engineering, especially in those days. Because if you remember, I was in my late 20s. The engineers in the blockhouse and in the command area were also my age, because they all been in engineering. So we were all a bunch of young guys in our late 20s and early 30s, and the astronauts were in their 30s. The astronauts were older than most of the rest of us. And we were doing this program. I had the easy part. They had to figure out how to do it, and using computers that were ancient. We didn't have cell phones in those days.
Right.
And they were doing it with really antiquated stuff.
The whole room, that just.
The whole room was filled with a computer.
And
It
her
was
laptop
like-
has
it was-
got more.
Well, that room was what, about 100 feet long by about 50 or 60 feet wide? And it was just chock full, and that was it.
That's right, that's right. We had 2 huge computers, well, they were huge, but they weren't very powerful.
We didn't have much memory. Right?
Yeah, so and to run the whole program that way was really, when you think about it, it's just an amazing feat.
Well, think of all the slide rules they had, though.
Yeah, well, slide rain on a slide.
Most of those guys, that's how they worked, was on those, with those slide rules.
When I went to nuclear power school, we had to use a slide.
Yeah, same here when I was,
When I went to electronics school, I didn't learn how, and I found it in my drawer the other day, and I opened it up and I looked at this thing, and I'm going,
Yeah, I don't even remember.
I didn't even know what it
I
was.
used to work that. I used it in, that's right.
Oh, you used to do it fast.
Any other questions?
So before Wayne gives us the closing prayer, Christine, Kyle's out of town, so I'm sure she'd appreciate some help putting things back in order.
But before that, I wanna, can we give a round of applause? Big part, and to be there, even if you were just a small part of it, it is a phenomenal thing, and I didn't know that God had you there. Think about the equipment they were using, and gosh.
I think that he has, when we've talked about stuff in the past, he has mentioned stuff like that, like the Apollo 13 and all of the prior stuff, that there had to be so much inspiration involved, and so I agree that it had to be.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of business items. The Philippines have offered to have empty nesters down at their temple